Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you have just joined a new season of Architecture Talk, this podcast dedicated to advance the frontier of architectural thinking. I've been taking a break for a quarter while I was on sabbatical, and now I am back at work and with the new season of this podcast. This season, my plan is to have a series of interlinked conversations, perhaps multiple episode conversations, to dig into some topics in greater depth. As I'm recording them, editing them, and getting them ready, we want to start off the season by doing a replay of some episodes from the past. In particular, we're going to do 3 episodes which cover conversations with significant people whom I love and I miss, who have in fact passed away in the last year or so. The first of these conversations is with my very good friend Anthony Vidler, architectural historian and former dean of the Cooper Union School of Architecture, who passed away a few months ago. It's a great conversation, and if you know Tony at all, you will have a sense that this is him at his usual erudite best. I hope you enjoy this. Here we go.
Architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each episode we try and have a conversation with a contemporary thinker to advance the frontier of architectural thinking. Today I am talking with my good friend and colleague Anthony Vidler, who has of course a distinguished career in the Architectural Academy as an architectural historian and as a critic and dean of the Cooper Union School of Architecture. I was over in New York for a day and met Anthony at his home. And what you're going to hear is simply a conversation that we had essentially over dinner and wine. We talk about a variety of things. We talk about contemporary practice. We talk of the nature of architectural history today. And we talk about his life and career. I loved this conversation. A lot of fun in recording it, and I hope you enjoy it. Let's first access the wine.
Anyway, cheers.
That's the best thing. Cheers.
Wonderful to have you
So
on.
good. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me back. It's always such a pleasure to come to New York.
Well, I'd have you back more often if you came more often, but well, we'll have to have you to the finals of the thesis reviews in the spring.
I would love to come.
Which is something that, for some reason, because I've been out of the picture for so long, has not been replicated often enough.
And you know, I love the Cooper thesis reviews, and I tell everyone about them. It's thought through, it's sort of referenced, it is sort of connected to the discourse and histories of architecture, not as sort of precedent study or any of that, but as sort of living culture of architectural thinking.
I think that you spoke of Cooper as not being totally involved in historical precedent, but also involved in the sort of intellectual thinking through of a problematic, which relates to a design and to a question in the universe or a question in the world.
Right.
And I think that's true. And I think Cooper actually has always, from the time of certainly from the time when Haydock took over as chair and then as dean, has always resisted, because he took over as chair and dean in the 60s, and then he became dean in 75. Always resisted the kind of history that postmodernism was delivering.
Right.
So he may have had a tremendously powerful connection to a kind of history of the modern movement, a kind of history of architecture.
Yeah.
But it was not the history that was being delivered by so-called postmodernism.
Right, right.
It was a history that was much more abstract, much
Right.
more empathetic in relationship to spatial organization
Right,
than it was to historical quotation.
right, right.
And so I think now the emphasis on precedent is a kind of a fill-in for loss, if you want.
Right,
a kind
right.
of a sense of how can we recuperate history without recuperating the kind of postmodernism of quotation and citation. So precedent has to be therefore a question of abstracting from a typological universe.
Right.
And it is true that when people like myself in the 70s were involved in questions of typology, it was precisely a resistance, a kind of abstraction of architectural prototypes in such a way as to resist historical quotation.
Right.
In the same way that we learned from Colin Rowe that it would be nice to envisage Corbusier playing with Palladio in an abstract way.
Yeah.
And transforming his centralization into a peripheral organization. In order to counter the very literal quotations that were emerging in the 70s and 80s
Yeah.
after Portuguese's Venetian extravaganza of the La Strada Novissima
Yeah.
in 81, 82.
Somewhere there, yeah.
That we were much more interested in recuperating the abstraction of history than we were recuperating the signs of history,
Right.
which were, I think, very much a product of the rather over literal assimilation of structural semiology in architecture as a kind of theory of meaning,
Right.
which I think Baird and Jenks were totally involved in at the
Right,
time,
sure.
in the 70s, where we were trying to sort of counter this. Let's search for the semiotic element.
Right.
Let's search for the meaningful element in historical discourse, which became very literal. Right, the Palladian facade of Venturi's mother's house, for
Right.
example,
Right.
which I actually find much more abstract than much later postmodernism of the gentleman that you know.
Let's leave it at that.
Since they're all friends of mine.
What do you think about the valence of thinking in the era of, climate change and sustainability and sort of this extremely technologized and urgent
Well, I
sense
think
of
it's both technologized and it's still Hegelian. In other words, it has this extraordinary effect of the big narrative.
Yeah.
So the big narrative that was progress in the Enlightenment, the big narrative that was the Hegelian dialectics of historical development towards a kind of philosophical community that was in Hegel, that got adopted as the kind of structure of academic history,
Right.
In art history and in all other histories. I still think that the chronological narratives of the Anthropocene, the chronological narratives of the catastrophe theories in relationship to climate change, which I think are absolutely correct,
Of course.
and certainly worthy of complete panic,
Yeah.
are in fact obscuring the possibilities of any form of mediatory action in the present.
Okay. What do you mean by that? Mediatory action
for example,
in the present?
there was a very nice little piece in Eflux the day before yesterday, maybe it was even yesterday, by a small group of architects and thinkers who were working between Eastern Europe and Rotterdam and Vienna in terms of thinking through what we do as architects as we are living the catastrophe and not awaiting the catastrophe.
Right. You think it sort of
I think we're already in the
circumcises
ca- I
agency.
think we
We are in
already
the
have
catastrophe.
already been in the catastrophe
For a while, yeah.
since industrialization,
Okay.
1800.
Yeah.
I think, in fact, we've always been already in the catastrophe, and that we've enabled certain populations to survive well
Right,
in
right.
terms of political influence, economic influence, and technological sophistication.
Uh-huh.
We no longer are worried, not quite as worried as we were in Manchester as Engels was,
Right.
in terms of smoke pollution.
Uh-huh. We're not?
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
We're no longer as worried.
Yeah,
right?
okay. But about the same,
But
yeah.
we are certainly worried in Mumbai.
Yeah, of course. And Delhi, yeah.
Not just smoke pollution, pollution of every other kind.
Yeah, of course, of course.
You burn off the crops. The crops have been anesthetized by chemicals, and the chemicals come back to haunt us in the city.
So you're saying this is an old discourse? It's
Totally.
been totally.
And I think, in a way, that the discourse of progress and the discourse of Hegelian dialectic is a discourse that was a defensive discourse
Right, right.
against something that was already there.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And I think, in a way, the first intimations of this sense of living the catastrophe
Yeah.
are in something like Voltaire's essay on the Lisbon earthquake, or Diderot's.
Unpack that for us. Voltaire's essay on the Lisbon earthquake.
Well,
Yeah.
how can we live under a God that rages so powerfully
Uh-huh.
against us in nature?
Yeah, yeah.
What is the relationship of nature if nature revolts so strongly
Yes.
against us,
Yes.
while we ourselves
What
are
is our
living in
relation?
nature?
Yes.
right? It's the beginning of volcano research. It's the beginning of
Right.
of what happened to Pompeii.
Right,
Nobody ever thought of what happened to Pompeii
Right, right.
until the Lisbon earthquake.
Right. Right. I
so
see.
for me,
Yes,
for
yes.
me, for me, modernity is the defensive realization that we are already on a course to a kind of auto destruction, whether or not we know when it will be, or whether or not we know what it will be.
Right.
We know that it's not going to be kind.
Yes. Okay, if that's the case, then what is the project of Utopia? I mean, what are we fighting
Utopia
for?
is precise. No, I think the project of Utopia is precisely, on the one hand, as in Thomas More, it's a project of idealizing colonialization, of idealizing how one might in fact construct worlds outside the worlds we know, but which can in fact be constructed according to rules that, Robinson Crusoe knew exactly how to do it. He established a nice little colonial operation
Of course,
on his
right on
island
that
out of
two-person.
Manfredi's first enslavement.
Right.
So I don't know.
So you're totally cynical about the Utopian
I'm not
project?
cynical.
Oh, okay.
I'm historically critical.
All right.
It cannot be cynical about it.
Yes.
No.
Okay.
Utopia doesn't mean anything else but no place.
Yeah.
So
sure.
no place is just imagining whatever you want to imagine is
Yeah.
going to happen.
No, but you're
in
saying it's a
some place.
specific. It's a colonial site.
I think so.
Yeah.
And it was actually demonstrated by the missionaries in Paraguay, for example, where they actually attempted to set up More's utopian civilization.
It's
in
also the
Europe.
ethos of America, is it not? I mean, America itself.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. It's a settlement. Basically, Utopia is a settlement plan.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you go back to Plato, there's nothing in Plato that's not about Greek expansion. Defense of Athens, and Athenian control of its provinces at a moment when that control is breaking down under the threat of the Persian Empire.
So you think the entire modernist narrative and ethos and ethic of progress is Hegelian?
No, I think the narrative that Hegel constructed a narrative that allowed for intellectuals to understand chronology as having a kind of motive, as opposed to just being one day after the next.
Okay.
Well, I mean, the dialectic of history for Hegel is towards a is a movement in, if you take the aesthetics, for example, you have the aesthetics which starts off with an architecture, which is, as he calls it, the symbolic moment, where a stone, which has never been called anything else, or has never been called anything before it's a stone, it doesn't exist before it's called a stone, is shaped and called something else, an altar, right, or a temple,
Right.
which leads to the possibility of building a big stone like a pyramid, which means the possibility of inhabiting that as a place to bury the dead, which leads to the possibility of building more stones which you inhabit in order to worship the gods, which leads to his apotheosis, which is the romantic moment where there's a cathedral where the community of the Christian church can worship, where the form of the cathedral and the form of the worship and the form of the community are at one, at which point, with a little bit of help from philosophers, you don't need that anymore either.
So to bring it back to the present, if you're theorizing contemporary practice which articulates itself as a response to the urgency of climate change, as a part of the repetitious Hegelian dialectic of the crisis of modernity, let's just say for shorthand, then
that's the narrative structure.
That's the narrative structure. So, but what is agency in this case?
In which we're taught to live.
In which we're taught to live. So, what is architectural agency?
Well, precisely.
This is
precisely. I feel that the concentration, I think, is important for students. I think it's important for all of us to register the fact that we're living within that narrative. That we're living the catastrophe. The catastrophe is not going to come. It's not about to come.
Yeah.
It's already with us.
Yeah.
So that the catastrophe has to be lived in such a way. I mean, Donna Haraway has developed one form of understanding of living with the troubles. Right. I would say that the problem is with architecture is that architecture has always had a narrative which has an agency within its discipline, from Vitruvius to the repetition of Vitruvius and the reduplication and the transformation of Vitruvius in the Renaissance, all the way through. It has its historical roots, and it has its historical continuous transformations, right? So that Beaux-Arts transformation of an 18th century Vitruvian discourse can be understood in compositional terms, which then in compositional terms can be transformed into taking historical types and recomposing them, so that we can still see someone like Jim Sterling in the Leicester engineering building,
right,
looking at Melnikov and using Melnikov and
right,
thinking he's part of a tradition,
right,
but also some thinking also, and he writes this, of making more complex and more immediate the language of modernity, the language of modern architecture. So, having, I think, lost that particular connection to a historical discipline, we're now plunged into the big narrative,
right,
and we are given various technological apparatuses to either counter the narrative or to analyze the narrative, right? And I don't think that that's enough for architecture. And I think that we're in a moment now where we have to actually scale down.
Scale down?
Yes.
What do you mean?
We have to scale down. We have to understand that architecture is not going to solve a crisis that or a catastrophe that we're living in.
Right.
But it has a role in mediating on the one hand, the extraordinary power of the technological instruments that are being put together by cooperatives and by engineers and by scientists in order to counter the catastrophe. There's not a single architect in those cooperatives.
Okay.
And
so you're saying that's the appropriate site for that response?
What I'm saying, well, it could be one of the interesting things about the little efflux article I read day before yesterday, is that they are talking about, yes, they're living in a catastrophe. What can you do? You can't just sit back. You can't develop business as usual. You have to establish resistance in relationship to cooperating with a group of resistors who are in localities,
Right.
and at the same time try to enter the discussion as architects and designers of the engineers and the technologists who are claiming that they are going to be able to solve the crisis.
So architects as citizens, as community members, and also as providers
say
of partial
As,
solutions.
as designers.
As designers, yeah. So
I was particularly moved when I went to Yale in April for a symposium which brought a group of experts and architects around the Japanese condition from Hiroshima to Fukushima. It was something like resistance and resilience as a symposium.
Okay.
And I was particularly moved by the narratives of the group Bow Wow that came.
Yeah.
And who talked about the way in which they had been energized to enter the territory of after the Fukushima nuclear and tsunami.
Yeah.
Right? Finding a community which was a survival community, which was the shattered pieces of communities that had bonded already together because the bureaucracy had been completely slow and ineffectual and so on. They'd already bonded for survival in the way in which they found and sourced goods that were stored somewhere else, and where grocers, little grocers said, yeah, we have a depot back in here, we can bring untainted goods and so on.
Urgent, almost situationist.
An urgent situation.
Yeah.
And that then talking to that community, which basically said, we don't want to go back to where we were.
Right.
We now are a different community.
Yeah.
Right? And being able to source materials for building and ways of constructing temporary shelters for community activities, for habitat, in such ways that not only could they not be temporary, they could extend,
Right.
but also it was not just disaster housing, it was not just temporary shelter, it was an architecture which bonded with the needs of a particular group of survivors.
Right.
And to me, one could actually begin to think architecture not just in terms of survival, not just in terms of sort of catastrophe,
Disaster response.
Yeah. But in terms of developing material and spatial prototypes for living the disaster.
Interesting.
Living the catastrophe.
Living the disaster, living the catastrophe.
Which we're in.
Yes.
Which we're in. Whether we're in Brooklyn,
Right.
or whether in Fukushima, or whether we're in Mumbai.
One way to read that is learning to give up the ghost of eventual utopia.
Yes, totally. I've always resisted that.
Yeah.
My interest in Utopia, I have to say, interest in Utopia was sparked in the 70s, the late 60s and early 70s, in a small group in London with Martin Pauly, the critic, and with others who were, we were absolutely amazed at the hubris of architects who thought that architecture could reconstruct society. The hubris of that kind of utopianism.
Sure, yeah,
where
very
architecture
much.
was the right. So my first efforts at unpacking that particular hubris were Fourier and Ledoux.
Right.
I don't idealize either of them, but I do think that both of them are, in some way or another, keys to the kind of kernel keys to the basic false utopianism of architecture.
What do you mean by that?
That architecture can construct and transform society by itself.
Right.
That
right.
you put people in the unité d'habitation and think they're going to be
No.
nice.
No, but return to Ledoux and Fourier. I mean, so what are you saying about that? About
they are the theorists of that
kind of thinking,
of that
thought.
That thought.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So I'm not someone who, talks. In the postmodern era, I was always thought of as somebody who talked about Ledoux because I thought he was a wonderful visionary.
Yeah. Well, that's
what I was talking about.
That's what happens when you write the canonical sort of book on the Enlightenment and architecture.
Right, but at the same time, my enlightenment is deeply inflected by Foucault's enlightenment, which is
of course.
the dark side of rationalization and rationalism, right? So it's Adorno after the Holocaust.
Right. Let's switch gears here. So Tony, how did you get into history and theory in where did you grow up in England? Liverpool? No, I'm not thinking.
No. I was a very asthmatic, nerdy, Proustian kind of child in Essex.
Okay.
Which is a absolutely benighted realm. Benighted realm to the east of London.
Okay. I'd better explain what benighted means. Our listeners, I don't think it's a term in.
It's a lost, forgotten realm that stretches from the outskirts of London to the marshes of Southend.
Okay, yeah. So you're from the.
So
out of nowhere.
Out of nowhere, the one thing about Essex is it's mostly flat.
Okay.
And the one way to escape my suburban household was by bicycle.
Right.
And the bicycle allowed me to roam, church by church, medieval cottage to medieval cottage. I drew, I cataloged, I wrote little books on these churches and there. I did brass rubbings on there.
What kind of churches were there? What kind of churches were there? I mean, those are like.
I mean, there's a church in every town.
Right. So
there's a church in every village, and everything from Anglo-Saxon churches to Norman churches to Gothic churches to Gothic revival churches, right, in my town. So, I just got so interested in the historical. I suppose it was a kind of escape from where I was in this nasty little suburb, and it was such an incredible relief to go with my brass rubbing equipment.
Brass rubbing, okay.
Where you
could take rubbings.
A piece of paper and black.
They were set up for rubbings, or people just did that.
Well, you did that. I mean, you hoped that you weren't going to be chased out the church.
Okay.
Yeah. But usually, if you met the priest, he would ask you in. I was very interested. Anyway, my first life was as a medieval historian.
Okay, I did not know that.
And in fact, in my time, you couldn't go. I don't think you can anyway. You couldn't go up to Cambridge or Oxford or anywhere else.
Yeah.
And in Cambridge, you certainly couldn't go up to Cambridge to read architecture. You had to go up. You had to take your exams for Cambridge in a proper humanistic subject, right? So my exams for Cambridge, first of all, there are state exams, which I got, and I could have gotten into Cambridge that way. But then I wanted to get to the scholarship level, and so I, studied for translation in Latin, Greek. Medieval Latin, Anglo-Saxon, Italian, and French.
Wow!
And then wrote a whole series of papers over a week, staying in Cambridge as a acolyte for Cambridge, on the problem of the papal successions and the papacy's disputes in the 13th and 14th centuries and the Doomsday Book and whatever it was that I was asked, right?
Right.
So I got my scholarship in medieval history at to Cambridge.
Uh-huh.
I was a major scholar at Emmanuel College,
Okay.
and immediately switched from medieval history to architecture because I wanted to do that all along.
Okay.
And the first
So architectural history or architecture?
architecture.
Oh, okay.
Architecture.
Uh-huh,
I'm
yeah.
a professional. I was trained
Yeah.
for 3 years as RIBA Part 1,
Yeah,
2
yeah.
years at graduate as RIBA Part 2.
Okay.
And I was about to go into Sandy Wilson's office to design the British Library before I came to the States.
Right. Okay.
So anyway, so I got to Cambridge,
Yeah.
and Emmanuel College had...
No, but with this sort of deep interest in medieval churches and so on, and this history, why was the secret plan really to become a ARIBA, or
Well, because my father,
Yeah.
who was someone who never went to university but went through apprenticeships to become... he became a major civil servant in the area of land and building surveying, but he wanted me to do something practical.
Right.
And, he at one point said, "Well, if you can get a scholarship, that's all fine by me. But if you don't, I'm going to send you to the Merchant Navy." And my problem there was that I could stand on the shore and see a boat going up and down and get seasick. So this was not an option.
Not an option.
Right?
So like,
At all.
I'd better get my ARIBA.
I better get into Cambridge.
Get
Anyway.
into Cambridge.
And I wanted to go to Cambridge. I mean, there were 3 possible schools of architecture at that time. There was the AA, which was not a university, and I wanted to go to university.
Yeah.
And there was Liverpool, which
Yeah.
was a university, but it was still very, very tightly organized around its post-Beaux-Arts
Yeah.
visions.
Yeah.
And so Cambridge, which had just been established in 57, 58 by Leslie Martin.
Yeah.
And Leslie Martin was the first architect to get a PhD in the history of architecture. He did Spanish Baroque architecture.
Yeah.
And he was also head of the RIBA Education Committee that reformed the educational structure of architects, and was given the chair of architecture at Cambridge in order to take this little real estate operation into an architectural operation.
All right.
And then he brought to Cambridge a whole series of people, all the people as visitors that he had in the circle just before the war with Ben Nicholson and Nam Gabo and Antoine Pevsner and so on, plus Colin St. John Wilson, with whom he had worked at the LCC housing office.
Right.
And Leslie built the Festival Hall, but he also was chief architect of the LCC. And Sandy Wilson had done a whole series of housing estates.
Right.
So he brought Sandy Wilson, but Sandy Wilson was also brought with him as a series of visitors the independent group.
Right.
So
you read with all of them? You studied with all of them?
So they all came as critics.
Yeah,
I mean, Allison and Peter Smithson, Paolozzi came to teach us how to do sculpture. Henderson in terms of photography. I mean, they were part of our group in Cambridge.
Oh, yeah.
And the big shift towards not just being a medievalist, but also being an architectural, was my first visit to Venice. As a school trip when I was 14 or 15. And 2 things happened. I tasted food for the first time. And when I went to the public library to ask for some reading about Venice, the public librarian said, well, I think we can get you something nice. And they presented me with the 3 folio volumes of Ruskin's Stones of Venice on interlibrary loan from Edinburgh University, hand painted by Ruskin.
Wow.
Right. And I just devoured this before I went to Venice. And then when I got to Venice, it was magic. And it still is, actually, to me. I still have a thing about Venice. And it revived itself through the years with my friendship with Manfredo Tafuri and the School of History there. But that was incredible. So I got into Cambridge, and then I had a gap between like January and October, and I went to Venice, and I stayed in Venice in a cheap little pensione,
Right.
and I photographed and drew every single Gothic window that Ruskin had ever thought about.
Right.
And so I went up to Cambridge a full Ruskinian.
Okay.
First day, a note in my box in the manual saying I should see my tutor, because at Cambridge you have tutors.
Yeah.
And you meet with your tutor every week
Yeah.
through the terms, and the tutor gives you readings and all kinds of assignments and discussions that gives you another level of understanding beyond just the lectures you go to.
Yeah.
So this little note said, you're meeting your tutor at on Friday or something or other, and you should telephone him at this number.
Yeah.
So at 9 o'clock in the morning, I telephoned him on my second day at Emmanuel,
Yeah.
at that number, and a voice came. No, never before midday. I will allow only Mozart to wake me up. So I put it down. It was Colin Rowe.
Of course.
So for 2 years, I met with Colin Rowe on Fridays at 5 o'clock,
Right,
until
okay.
the martinis ran out at midnight, and I had to climb over the wall back into Cambridge. Right?
Yeah.
And so, first time, what are you interested in? Well, I'm very interested in Ruskin. Ruskin? No, not Ruskin. Le Corbusier.
Okay.
So that was it. And
All
the
right.
second great influence was that arriving with me in 1960 at Cambridge I was a very, very over-educated and completely overstimulated young undergraduate, and immediately very close to Colin. I mean, Colin and I got on very well immediately. Because he saw that I was a complete nerd and was totally into that, right? And was a young PhD student from Columbia who just gone through the Korean War but come back, and then got his Fulbright and came to Cambridge as a PhD student. And he because he was already an architect, he'd studied at Cornell and graduated at Columbia. He was given by Sandy Wilson, who had to go at that moment, to teach at Yale, one of those visiting positions. He was given the first year to teach.
I see.
Peter Eisenman.
I see.
The destiny between Colin and Peter, between Scylla and Charybdis. There I was.
There you are.
As this young kid who was completely fascinated by abstraction on the one hand and historical mannerism on the other.
Right. And then you came to the U.S. I think Peter Eisenman invited you.
What happened was that Peter left in '63. My then wife typed his thesis, and I sort of corrected his footnotes, and we managed to put his thesis in while he was on honeymoon. And then he went to Princeton as a first job.
Yeah.
And as an assistant professor, and I was just about to go into Sandy Wilson's office in London, because I had worked with him and built the first model for the British Library.
Yeah.
And he wanted me to take that on. And when Peter called and said, "Well, look, we got a 1-year position at Princeton, half teaching, half research. You want to come over for a year?"
Yeah.
I'd already been there for a long summer in '64. Doing my master's thesis in history on McKinley and White in the offices of McKinley and White, and looking at their archives. And I thought it was fantastic. New York, to me, was just extraordinary.
Right.
So I said, well, why not? And so I went to Princeton for a year, and 27 years later I left.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about transculturality. Do you think you've become an American?
I think there's something about. I used to talk to my friend T.J. Clark, who was at Cambridge with me, and then he also went to. I think he went to Essex, and then he went to Oxford, and then he went to Harvard, and then he went to Berkeley.
Yeah.
Whether we became American or not, there was something we could do with what with our intense desire to construct a world of thought in our disciplines in America that we couldn't do in England.
Why not?
Because of the incredible sort of rigidity and absolute conviction that English institutions had that they were right, and that change really couldn't happen.
Unnecessary, yeah.
When I got to Princeton, I was 2 years later. I was an assistant professor. I was on the PhD committees. I was involved with Kenneth Frampton in the establishment of a history theory curriculum. When Ken left in 71, 72, and I got tenure, I was immediately given the role of the chair of the PhD program that I could then establish as an interdisciplinary program between structures, sociology, history, and theory, which then became a model for the MIT program that Stanford Anderson started.
Right.
There was something you can do.
Right.
I mean, in Cambridge, you could.
No ways.
No way.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Yeah. So you felt like you were
felt
a young Turk, and
you were liberated.
Yeah.
And also Geddes, as the new dean of Princeton, the first dean at Princeton, came with a tremendous sense of the value of research, whether it was scientific research, sociological research, or urban research, or historical research. He wanted to be, in one way or another, I think the Leslie Martin of American education.
Right.
He was in fact the head of the AIA Commission for Reform in the 60s.
Okay.
And he also took advantage of the fact that the Princeton School of Architecture is not. But Princeton doesn't have professional schools.
Right.
It has two professional schools. It has the School of Architecture and it has the Woodrow Wilson School of Public Affairs.
Right.
But they're not like Harvard professional schools.
Yeah.
They are integrated in their the faculty of those two schools is the faculty of the arts and sciences.
Yeah.
So there's one faculty at Princeton.
Right.
And there's one provost and one administration, so that the ability of being able to bring in a historian to your class in architecture, or a historian to bring in you to a class in history or in anthropology or whatever, you can make, as first Karl Schorsky and I made, and then I continued, major interdisciplinary programs with architecture as part of parcel. Right. In the School of Architecture, most of my first PhD students, who are now teaching everywhere, from Mary McLeod to Pat Morton, were involved in getting the first Mellon grants to bring interdisciplinary people. We were the first people to give Gayatri Spivak. The English department wouldn't invite Gayatri Spivak to Princeton at that point in the 70s. No way. He came and lectured in Betts Hall in the architecture school.
Really?
Yes.
In the 70s?
Yes.
When she was translating of grammatology?
Yes.
No.
Because we were the theory group.
Really?
We were the people that were allowed. The architecture was the center for because of myself, Ken Frampton, and then Gunther Nitschke, who came from Japan, was a German, but tremendously interested in ritual and in Japanese architecture. He taught with me for many years at Princeton.
Right.
And there was a tremendous interest in history that was not art history.
Right. Yeah.
That was a
Different.
fight that we had to fight, and that eventually, I think, has now been resolved, but it took a long time.
That's a fascinating narrative. I
We
did
were
not know that.
An extraordinary community of intellectuals there.
Yeah, in the 70s.
Yeah.
At Princeton.
Well, yeah, because
Yeah.
we had Karl Shortsky, cultural historian.
Yeah,
Anna
amazing.
Meyer,
Yeah.
political historian.
Yeah.
And then younger faculty came in like Tony Grafton, and
Right.
we have Bob Danton. They were all interested in architecture.
Right, right.
They brought into the history department. They brought a whole slew of French historians from the 6e section, Mona Ouzouf, Jacques Ouzouf, a whole range of French intellectuals who were involved in this post-structuralist
Right.
movement.
Yeah.
The history department didn't bring Foucault.
Right, right. I
So
see.
it was a moment where architecture was able to be the agent of an interdisciplinary discourse,
Fascinating.
and where because of my relationships with France, Kenneth's relationships with Britain, Geddes' relationships with the American community, it just took off.
Yeah.
It was extraordinary. What I'm trying to intimate, because when I usually talk about this to students, they say, "Well, I don't think it's ever stopped."
Right.
In different ways, it has continued in different forms, in different relationships to different disciplines. Architecture has always been the interdisciplinary discipline,
Right.
and universities who have schools of architecture that can, in one way, both assimilate and generate these interdisciplinary threads have always been. I think it was interesting because when I got to Princeton, there was a wonderful old French teacher, Jean Labattu, who was a Beaux-Arts graduate, who had very, very strong modernist tendencies, and so he left France, went to Havana. Actually, he planned the waterfront for Havana, and then came to Princeton in the 20s and took over the the Department of Architecture graduate program, and taught Venturi, Moore, Turnbull, and a whole slew of students, both architecture in the Beaux-Arts compositional sense,
Right.
in the historical sense, but at the same time totally convinced that modernity was important.
Right.
Brought Le Corbusier to talk at Princeton in the late 20s.
Yeah.
Was architect of that extraordinary multinational fountain in different colors at the World's Fair in
Right.
30.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And he was the architect of that.
I see.
And so he was both.
Right.
Right. That's why, for example, Charles Moore did his thesis at Princeton on water.
I see. Yeah, interesting.
Anyway, so Princeton was already ready for that.
Yeah. But it happened. So let's return to this. What you're saying, that this is the sort of notion of architecture as this sort of cross-disciplinary space of discourse and thinking.
Right.
It has never stopped. Where is it going, or where would you like
Okay.
to see it go?
Let me give a little. I think there were two problems
Yeah.
in this. One was that there were, as long as the different disciplinary threads, the different interconnections were kept in suspension in relationship to design and in relationship to the organization of.
What do you mean in suspension?
Well, they didn't come down and I am going to be a sociological architect, or
Oh,
I'm going
okay,
to be a
that's
semiological
yeah,
architect.
they didn't become dogmatic.
or I'm
in
going
that
to be a
sense.
Foucauldian
Yeah,
architect,
yeah.
right? That they were kept in suspension as an intellectual, as the febrile intellectual
Firmament kind of
the
matrix.
brain,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
brain of architecture,
yeah,
if
yeah.
you want,
Yeah.
as opposed to the
Ideology.
the ideology of architecture.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Then I think we were in great shape.
Right.
The minute that semiology became a discipline to solve architecture,
Yeah.
or that Foucault became a discipline to see architecture only as a surveillance problem,
Right.
or and so on. Right?
Yeah. I see.
The minute that the different discourses were separated from each other in conversation,
Right.
to become authorizations for a particular kind of architecture, as
Right,
opposed to
right.
that, then I think there's a problem.
Yeah.
Right.
And then do you think that
Just
happened?
as if a certain scientific or high tech or
Yeah.
technological
Right.
aspiration, or a
Right.
programmatic Chris Alexander operation, right? They all bifurcated,
Yeah.
right? And that, I think, is still a problem.
I think you're. It sounds to me like you're describing the 80s and
Probably.
yes, and it's still a problem, right?
Yeah, I think so.
But
But I'm describing what we would normally call postmodern, but I think postmodern is completely the wrong notion to describe it. It's the wrong descriptor. It's all modern. But it's the way modernity sets its sights on a particular investment strategy, and invests in semiology, or invests in, or brand, and so investment and branding and how you brand your architecture becomes a kind of a narrowing of discourse. And
so you're seeing postmodernism conventionally thought as sort of the semiotic branding, semiotic representational strategy as a kind of a particular ideological branding of modernism.
I think that the name postmodern, which my friend Charles, the late lamented Charles, was a very good friend. I always felt that he, because he was trained, by Banham was trained by Pevsner, he was trained by Banham. They all were trained in an art historical mode of having to label something. And to label something kills it.
Right.
And it actually kills it as a thought process.
Right.
Right. So I
agree.
I don't want to
absolutely.
think of. I don't think of Frank Gehry and Venturi, and I don't want to think of them as not contemporary, as not modern. I mean, they are all part of. Peter Eisman is as much postmodern as anybody else.
Sure.
Right. I mean, if you think of postmodern as an art historical identification of something after what art history has already called modernism.
Yeah.
Which is crazy anyway.
Yeah.
Because if you're talking about modernism, you're talking about the most incredibly small aspect of, or the tiny aspect of what happened in the 20s and 30s. I mean, are you going to talk about modernism and Tessenhoff? Are you going to talk about modernism and Tautz? The notion of the modern movement, the notion of modernism, the motion, and the way in which they've all become crystallized in courses,
right?
Theory courses, which autonomize. These poor graduate students that have to read Deleuze without having a single notion that Deleuze on the Fold is talking about Leibniz. I mean, how can that's okay if you're a philosopher, if you have some kind of intercepted philosophy. But to just take it as a diagram that allows you to play with curves in parametric formation, it's nothing to do with that. So I'm against the autonomization of these strands of thinking.
Right. But you said once earlier in our conversation, we've resolved our quarrel, or whatever you want to call it, with art history. You seem to suggest that we have kind of got beyond that. What did you mean by that? Did you say that?
Oh, I still feel that the relationships between architectural history as a discipline and art history as a discipline are problematic.
Right. Yes.
That's all I can say. I mean, there are art historians who overcome the problematic, and there are architectural historians who overcome the problematic.
Right.
But in relationship to someone like myself who is trained as an architect
Right.
and who think like an architect, in relationship to all the questions that architecture has to ask.
Yeah.
The isolation of those aesthetically or in temporal periodization or in stylistic formations or in any way cuts up the possibility of thinking holistically about it,
Right.
even the building.
Right. Okay, as we move towards the end over here, so having now stepped down as dean at Cooper Union and traveling between several institutions, what are you working on now? What's on your keyboard, or what's keeping you awake?
What keeps me awake is all the questions that my students ask me. That's the one thing.
Right.
And I can never actually resolve or solve how they, to any extent of, and I don't want to resolve those questions.
Right.
Those are questions that are legitimately asked,
Right. Right.
and legitimately should remain questions.
Right. Right.
I've never in my life ever set out to write a book, so I write always on invitation, stimulation, and pressure. So somebody asks me to do something as an article or as a commentary, I always resist. I say, I know nothing about this. I can't do this.
Yeah.
And then I say, okay, well, maybe I'll do it. And eventually, after several deadlines are missed, I will produce the article.
Uh-huh.
Over a period of years, sometimes 3 or 4 years, sometimes 5 years. With the 18th century, it was like 10 years. I look back on what I've written and published and think, there's something that unifies these different articles or these different things, which is what I was interested in at that moment.
Right.
Whether it was 18th century Enlightenment, whether it was just investigating this strange character, Ledoux, which I still haven't pinned him down. Whether it was investigating the incredible, trying to decipher the extraordinary handwriting on thousands and thousands of pieces of paper that Charles Fourier produced in his archive.
Yeah.
Whether it was in contact with people in Princeton who were deeply involved in, a kind of post-Freudian Lacanian discourse of psychoanalysis and trying to test out whether or not there was something in architectural discourse, certainly in textual discourse, that resonated. And why was it that Freud's case studies were always based on short stories? And why are those short stories about spaces and Roman ruins?
Yeah.
Or whether it was trying to come to grips with the technological revolution of parametrics and the strange forms that were emerging out of that in terms of spatial structures that were certainly not the spatial structures of rationalism that I had become attuned to and taught to design in warped space, or whether it was a series of reflections on the different historians and critics that had influenced me in my life. All those books came out of a series of articles that suddenly seemed to me, not suddenly, maybe over a year, teasing out the relationships among them were formed into a book.
Right.
So what I'm doing now is I'm writing articles and hoping that in the next
the dots will
few
connect.
years there's some thread which is about some thread which is about the notion of post atomic, post-war, post-Second World War architectural thought and practice, which has unified certainly a lot of the articles I've published in the last 4 or 5 years. Questions of bombing, questions of ruins, questions of memory, questions of dystopia, questions of fear, of trauma,
Yeah.
of post-atomic trauma.
Yeah.
So, at one moment,
Yeah.
I'm sure I will find a way of bringing those articles into some form. Ideally, I want them to be a kind of riposte, or if you like, a conclusion or a continuation. Let's say nothing's ever concluded. In the same way that Banham's Theories in Design in the First Machine Age was a response to the refusal of his professor Pevsner's to go beyond 1914, and so he went to 1939.
Yeah.
I don't find a work of theory let's take out the word theory, of architectural thought
Right.
in relationship to post-World War II, post-atomic conditions, post-nuclear, post-Holocaust conditions, that touches those architects and theorists and thinkers about architecture in the same way that Banham touched the theorists and thinkers about architecture from the First World War to the Second World War.
Okay.
So I hope, in a way, that it will be a continuation, if you like, of work, not about the architects of postmodernism or the architects of the post-war,
Right.
but about architecture
Right.
post-war.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we will look forward to that.
I do too.
Thank you. Thank you for.
But I hope it never finishes anyway.
I hope it never finishes anyway. It will never finish. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for all your work and your friendship, Tony. It's been such a pleasure.
Me too.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Mary Lee. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.